knowledge and history are not things that you find fossilized, you know, in some place. Knowledge and history are created. So there are enough, you know, archival, there are enough archaeological, there are enough, you know, materials that are available on you know, Africa's history. Now the point here would be that it would be a default, or rather it would be a false start if the point was, okay, Europe in the 16th century is doing this. What is Africa doing in the 16th century? Africa's history deserves to be written on its own outside of European history. Because when you start from the point that Europe in the 16th century, so you now accept the European categorization of time, the modern period. So you're going to say, you know, what was Africa doing in the pre-modern period or in the Middle Ages and in the ancient period? Now that categorization of history into those time periods belongs to Europe. This is how Europe studies its own history. So if you want to study the history of the continent and write it, you have to write it outside of those Western categories, you know, of time. And that history, that kind of history exists, you know. It's not as elaborate, or rather it doesn't exist in multiple texts as European, you know, history. Because, again, the library systems that we use are library systems that subscribe to the same principles that I've outlined. You know, they privilege Western knowledge. So when you are looking for, you know, that kind of history, you have to go to an Africana library. There's a library, and then there is an Africana library, or there is an African Studies library. So there is a proper library, and then there is a library for this kind of knowledge, you know, which is an exotic kind of knowledge. It's not evolving. It's unlike this kind of knowledge that is evolving, you know. So if you substituted, if you took out European knowledge and put it in that exotic library and put African, you know, history into the main library, what you do is to force it to evolve, because then it can't remain stagnant. It would have to continue, you know, to be reproduced. But what happens is that we teach people, you know, in universities like UCT, who in time basically turn away against their history and their culture, and therefore they have no interest in writing about it. Now, you know, epistemic apartheid. Apartheid is colonialism. You know, there's nothing peculiar about apartheid. Apartheid is colonialism as it existed everywhere in the continent. You know, the confusion in nomenclature, you know, about what happened here being apartheid and what happened in other, you know, parts of the continent being colonialism, you know, is analytically unhelpful. What happened here was colonialism. Colonialism in South Africa ended in 1994. That's when South Africa became independent. All through that, prior to that, South Africa was a colonial society. Now, but there is something else that, you know, maybe we can look at when we think about what happened in South Africa. It will bolster the point I was making. Now, if you look at the history of universities in South Africa, they have a very curious history. Take two universities. This university, University of Cape Town, and Wits University. Now, when Wits University begins, it was a mining college. So it was simply a mining college concerned with, because of course of mining, you know, in the Witwatersrand. Now, when the university, when the Union government, post, of course, 1909, when the Union government decided to expand, gave the proclamation for the expansion of the university into a fully fledged college in 1919, the very first other faculty that was established, you know, to augment the mining college was an Institute for Bantu Studies. Now the question is, why would a mining college that is expanding to become a fully fledged university think that the very first thing it must establish outside of the mining college is an Institute for Bantu Studies? Why doesn't it establish, you know, other related disciplines that would help, the development of the mining college? It is because universities in the continent have the primary task of first understanding the native in order to aid the process of colonial rule. So the Institute for Bantu Studies was meant to study the native. So from 1923, the Institute for Bantu Studies at Wits would begin publishing a journal called Journal of Bantu Studies. Continued to publish that journal up until 1984. Now what that tells you is that the foundational structures of our universities lock us into a certain relationality with these universities. The object of these universities is to understand us as natives that need to be civilized, that need to be dominated. So the object here was to understand, us so that we may then be made fit for colonial domination and subjugation. So we enter these universities, we enter modern disciplinary knowledges in a certain way. And the curious thing about the Journal of Bantu Studies is that it was not just dominated by anthropologists, or social scientists. Medical, practitioners published there, people in all the disciplines published there. And virtually all the articles, if you read them, or if you survey, the articles in the Journal of Bantu Studies, you would find that medical doctors were concerned with black people's notion of disease, black people's notion of hygiene, black people's relationship with, health matters. So even medicine locks us, in a certain kind of relationality. So it is not just the social sciences that lock us in that kind of relationality. So let us come to UCT. One of the very first, departments to be established at UCT in 1918 was the Center for Native Life and Languages. This is what would become the African Studies Center today. When it started as the Center for Native Life and Languages. Now, why does a university very early in its life find a need and a reason to establish a Center for Native Life and Languages? Again, it is because these universities have a mandate, to understand the native, in relation to Western civilization, but also it is that this is proof of how we enter, these universities, or how we enter modern disciplinary knowledges, of these institutions. So, epistemic violence, is integral to the development of these universities everywhere. Now, the question of hijacking of knowledge. Now, this happened. The answer here is that we have to think about this at two levels. Why is it that it becomes possible? For a moment, let us call it the hijacking of knowledges, from the rest of the world, as you put it. Why does it become possible for Europe to do that? I have explained that knowledge does not exist in isolation. Knowledge exists in relationship to, or it has a functional relationship with the modern industrial economic system or capitalist system. So when Europe, hijacks knowledges from other parts of the world and claim that they are European, it is able to rebrand them and export them to the rest of the world because it doesn't just possess the knowledge, it also possesses the means, capital, to transform people into modern rational people such that they can then absorb this knowledge and think of this knowledge as universal. Or rather, once they can relate to this knowledge, then it can claim to be universal. What all these other civilizations had was just knowledge. They did not have the instrument, maybe not even the instrument, they did not have the desire, to dominate other people such that they then assimilate their own knowledge. And I suppose there were empires that were powerful enough militarily, but again, they would have needed something more than just the military might to be able to do that. But they didn't have the desire to make their knowledges universal, such that they then banish the pluriversality of knowledge and make knowledge appear uni as one. So what Europe had, to its advantage is capital that transforms people and makes them subscribe to modern knowledge.
We'll take the second round of questions.
Second and last.
Okay, second and last round of questions. But one there, another one, and the third one. Any more hands? We'll take two.